developments in Kabul, but also very much to talk about what can the Indian engagement be. We are at a particularly interesting time, 3 months after the takeover of Kabul by the Taliban. It is still of its own description an interim government, not recognized by any other government in the world at present. And it is not just a work in progress. It is a work that has concerned capitals around the world. It's not just Afghanistan's oldest friends, but those in the neighborhood, those who have stakes, that have time and again signed on to international statements calling for a more inclusive government, calling for the rights of women to be secured, calling for the rights of minorities, calling for the end of support to terror groups, to terrorists, to groups within the interim government that are actually proscribed by the UN. But the question is also one of at what point does the world come to terms with a new reality in Afghanistan? So we're at that little point where the world is trying to figure out what they can do. Another interesting point that seems to have emerged in the last few days and has become clearer and clearer now is that with the exit of the US and NATO troops, it seems very clear that solutions to Afghanistan's crisis are going to be left to the region more than others. And we are seeing the region trying to at least come together, whether it is at the Moscow process, the Iran foreign ministers meeting. In Delhi, just held on Wednesday, was the meeting of national security advisors and security chiefs of 8 countries. China and Pakistan refused to decline the invitations. And in Islamabad, as we speak, is the meeting of what is called the extended troika of Russia, US, China. And again, it is in Islamabad, another recognition that these meetings and this future has to be discussed somewhere in the region. The Taliban foreign minister, Ataki, is in Islamabad as well and is meeting with this extended troika. So what we are seeing is essentially a shift of the debate to the region. Obviously, no conversation is complete without a shift to Afghanistan itself, and to have protagonists, to have speakers, to have players who are actually engaged and dealing with the challenges day by day. That's not always possible, but we've tried to bring to you as much of a cross-section through the views of our panelists. So let me just introduce all our panelists. There's Ambassador Ashraf Haidari. He's the Afghan ambassador to Sri Lanka, of course, appointed during the previous government. But he's there in Colombo, joins us now. Thanks so much for coming on to speak about the Afghanistan that you see at present and where you would like to see the solutions come from. Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay is the former Indian ambassador to Afghanistan. I should add, he's also the ambassador who reopened the Indian embassy after the last regime of the Taliban in 2001. Miss Hila Najib, she's famous to many of us in India as the daughter of President Najibullah, but of course is a scholar. She's a peace scholar. She's working on research about the Afghanistan diaspora at present. Mr. Ali Maisam Nazri, he's the head of the foreign relations of the National Resistance Front. This is a group that has intermittently been communicating with the public about where they hope to go, and I really do hope to hear from you about what the plans for the National Resistance Front are, given the new realities that seem to be emerging every day, the kind of engagements we are seeing between countries with Kabul, and the hopes that have been expressed by the international community that are still unfulfilled. And then we have Dr. Ashok Pehuria. He's a senior fellow of the Institute of Defense and Strategic Analysis, or the Manohar Parrikar Institute of Defense and Strategic Analysis in Delhi. And we do want to hear much more about the security conversations that have been held in Delhi amongst the NSAs. It's certainly been a very interesting meeting, because if I may add, this is the first time. New Delhi has been part of many conversations on Afghanistan since August the 15th. It has also been a part of the SCO, was chairing the session of, was the president of the session of the UN Security Council when the resolution 2593 was passed. But this is the first time we are seeing New Delhi, which has not really opened its engagement with Kabul quite yet, which has not actually been very a great recipient of those who wish to leave Afghanistan. So we haven't seen many Afghans come to India at present since August. It has offered food and medicine and aid, in fact, in a conversation between officials and the Taliban deputy prime minister, but that's not something Pakistan has agreed to. But New Delhi hasn't offered monetary support in any kind to the government, to the regime in Kabul to deal with this humanitarian crisis. So we're seeing New Delhi also evaluate its position, evaluate its role where it once saw itself as Afghan, no greater friend to New Delhi, and the other way around is how the government had described the relationship between the two. So it's interesting to see how India too is after the initial shock, and I think everybody was shocked by the rapid developments on August 15th. But after that shock, as we come to terms with reality, where do we see this going? I'm going to ask each of our speakers to give us their sense of the way forward in Afghanistan, not just what is there, but what they hope can be there, and also a realistic perspective, given that the Taliban regime, or the interim government as it calls itself, is in fact in place 3 months later. What is it that the world can really do? What can the region do? What can a country like India do when it comes to impressing on them that an inclusive government for the future is really the only way forward? Ambassador Hydari, if I could start with you.
I think you have to unmute yourself.
Well, I said thank you very much for that opportunity to speak on this panel of distinguished scholars, diplomats, and Afghans. I'm very grateful to Dr. Muradian for hosting this very timely discussion, and to my friend Suhasini Haidar for your very dedicated coverage of Afghanistan over the years, and for moderating tonight's discussion. For the sake of time, my 7 minutes, I will briefly touch on 4 key areas for Indian engagement in Afghanistan from an Afghan perspective, from an Islamic Republic perspective. 4 areas for constructive Indian engagement are intertwined and focus on people, peace and pluralism, prosperity, and environment. On each of these, there has been broad regional and international consensus. And India has adequate experience in each of those areas based on its 20 years of ongoing contributions to Afghanistan. So first, on people. India remains one of the most favored neighbors of Afghanistan, enjoying widespread favorability among all Afghans, including youth and women, who constitute an absolute majority of the Afghan people. And that's very important to remember, an absolute majority of the Afghan people. That's why India may explore opportunities for innovative, direct investment in the education and healthcare of the Afghan people. Of course, this can be done inside Afghanistan, as well as in India at the same time. Inside Afghanistan, India may draw on its prior in-country experience to provide suffering Afghans with integrated support in the form of relief, recovery, and development assistance. Delivery of such aid can be implemented by the UN agencies, international NGOs with poverty reduction experience in places like South Asia, Latin America, Africa, and India can choose and pick, and it's very good at doing so. and as well as trusted local NGOs. In India, the country may not only continue, but further expand, it's very important, further expand its vital scholarship program for the Afghan youth. Those graduating with an Indian degree will serve as goodwill ambassadors. We all know that, and Ambassador Mukhopadhyay knows that as well from his experience. And at the same time, there will always be an investment in the economic and governance sectors of Afghanistan. And for those Afghans already in India, they may be granted asylum and a path to naturalization. And I've been advocating for this naturalization of Afghans who are already in India as refugees. And then, of course, these students will graduate but will not be able to go back home. And so this should enable them naturalization to find employment in India and also elsewhere, especially in the Gulf states. And at the same time, when they're able to return home, they will go back home with not only education, but also work experience in India and as well as elsewhere. And at the same time, India, under the current circumstances, may take in more Afghan refugees that fear persecution under the Taliban. And India has not taken many, can take a lot more in terms of burden sharing in the region, can share the burden with Pakistan and India. Here, India can and should do a lot more than it does. And at the same time, India can and should do more to provide socioeconomic services, and especially at subsidized rates to Afghans who are already in India. And again, like I said, a path to naturalization as a long-term durable solution. So that's people. Second, peace and pluralism. Here, our neighborhood in the world know that peace and pluralism complement one another in the Afghan context, in the Sri Lankan context, in the Indian context, as well as in any other diverse country. In the past, and from the Taliban's own experience in the 1990s, we know that no one ethnic group can dominate Afghan politics and exclude others, especially women, who constitute more than half of our population. So what we are seeing in Afghanistan is absolutely unacceptable. The UN Security Council resolutions, as you just pointed out, the recent statements of trilaterals, Troika, extended Troika, REC, REX, and so many others, as well as the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals are clear on this issue, that you cannot govern, you cannot be secure now and down the road without women. And so is the text of the Doha Agreement, which is yet to be implemented. It is very rich on when it comes to inclusivity. And as well as the statements of the multilateral meetings, regional and the rest, which I pointed out, including yesterday's statement on the regional security dialogue on Afghanistan hosted by Delhi, which you pointed out. So moving forward, India may work with like-minded partners to push for the full implementation of the Doha Agreement, consistent with international consensus enshrined in the UN Security Council resolutions and the statements and the meetings which continue taking place in our region. This Indian diplomatic effort should help accomplish what the Afghan people have demanded since August 15. And that's the formation of an inclusive and broad-based government, which truly represent the will of the Afghan people, all ethno-sectarian and religious communities, including Hindus and Sikhs. And on counterterrorism, counter-radicalization, and counter-narcotics, India may consider playing a more active role in the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, under its regional anti-terrorism structure, or RATS. RATS has been there for a long time, but unfortunately, it is yet to be operationalized. And here, India can and should play a more active role in operationalizing RATS. And here, China, Russia, Iran, and Central Asians can and must support Indian initiatives under RATS to help eliminate the three threats in Afghanistan that directly fuel separatism in China and the rest of the SCO region. Third, and on prosperity, here India should continue its traditional focus on promoting and supporting full spectrum connectivity between South Asia and Central Asia through Afghanistan as a natural land bridge between the two regions of the rising Asia. As a win-win area of cooperation against confrontation, the member states of SCO, including China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, and Central Asians, would all have to collaborate, as the recent Tashkent Conference on Regional Connectivity called on our region, on our neighborhood, to walk the talk on win-win regional economic cooperation. As a first step, Pakistan should allow Afghanistan to import Indian goods overland through the Wagah Atari. At the same time, India, China, and Russia should collaborate to help Afghanistan facilitate regional investment in our natural resources sector following the formation of an inclusive government acceptable to all Afghans. Finally, environment. Here, as an outgoing Director General of the South Asia Cooperative Environment Program, or SACEP, which include all member states of SAARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. South Asia, regardless of our interstate tensions, can no longer afford not to cooperate with one another. And as we know from the recent discussions at the COP26 in Glasgow and the commitments made by all UN member states, that the status quo is no longer acceptable, that failing to cooperate regionally and globally can only add to natural disasters and catastrophes. Of all regions, South Asia, with a population of 2 billion people, most of them poor, is the most vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. On the Global Climate Risk Index, Pakistan and Afghanistan are rated as the most vulnerable to climate change and have the most to lose by failing to cooperate with one another as well as with the rest of the region to help the two countries mitigate and adapt to climate change. And that's why, in this light, I recently welcomed the call by you, Suhasini, for a One South Asia approach to addressing the transnational challenge of climate change, which continues to kill, displace, and starve suffering Afghans, as well as others across South Asia. And I end by arguing that even if regional peace is spoiling, doesn't end in Afghanistan, and I don't think if it would end anytime soon, our neighbors have to engage in environmental peace building, simply because climate change doesn't recognize any borders and will spare none of us. So I just end up here. I try to stay focused on what Indian engagement should look like moving forward, efforts that India should make along others to help form an inclusive government in Afghanistan, and then go about the business of, helping Afghanistan stand on its own, and with that, the rest of the region. I think those 4 areas for peace plus C plus an E, environment, should not only help Afghanistan, but the rest of the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and spoken very much like a diplomat, I should add, because the truth is that I want to come to you with questions after we've heard from everyone, but the truth is that everything you say is something all of us would desire. The reality right now is not really coming up to our expectations or our hopes. So I'm going to turn now to Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay, former Indian ambassador to Afghanistan. He's now with the Center for Policy Research and works on a number of issues, including focusing on Afghanistan. Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, a real tour de force from Ambassador Haidery, if you like, on what could happen in that perfect world. Yeah. Tell us where you see this going.
Right. Thank you very much, Suhasini. Let me start off by saying that it's a real pleasure and a delight to be part of this very distinguished gathering. You yourself, but also very eminent Afghan panelists today, and of some political consequence as well. So, I think you started off on a very good note, and I think Ambassador Ashraf Haidery also started off on a very good note. I think, spelling out, I think, some of the wishes of the Afghan people and the international community, and I think they very well reflected a lot of India's desires for Afghanistan as well. But I think you also sort of gave us a little reality check in saying, let's talk about the situation today, where it is going, and, what could be a possible way out towards reaching at least some kind of, livable consensus around Afghanistan. So I'd start off by saying that, events like what we have seen, the US withdrawal after 20 years, the military takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban, with the leadership really based and a lot of the support coming in from Pakistan. These are very seismic events, and they take years and years to unfold. If we just take the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, it took 2 years for the Soviet Union to collapse and the Soviet bloc to more or less disintegrate. It took 3 years for President Najibullah for his government to collapse. It took another 4 years of Mujahideen rule and intra-Mujahideen fighting, and then it took another 5 to 6 years of the Taliban rule before, in fact, we had a US intervention once again. And in many respects, if you look at the last 20 years, the last 20 years have been a period of relative stability, peace, and prosperity, a period in which, if I just take one metric, let alone sort of human indices like maternal mortality and education, and girls' education in particular, I take just one metric, which is migration, this was a period in which expatriates came back to Afghanistan instead of refugees going out of Afghanistan. And once again, after these 20 years, we are seeing a situation of, a refugee crisis, a humanitarian crisis, a looming economic crisis, a very dire security situation, and a very dire, I would say, prognosis for the future. And so let me begin with that sort of very severe reality check. And I say this entirely sharing the spirit of everything that Ambassador Haidery has said. One is that if I compare, and since I was there in November 2001 when the Taliban were ousted from Kabul and from Afghanistan, the atmosphere at that time was subdued. It was the period of Ramzan. The atmosphere was subdued, but it was peaceful, and there was a kind of cautious optimism about the future. And the first shots of gunfire that I heard was on the occasion of Eid, which happened to more or less coincide with the Bonn Accord. So there were actually celebrations, and gunfire was heard in celebrations. If we look at the inauguration of Taliban, what people call 2.0, but actually I consider 3.0, because 2.0 was the Taliban in Pakistan from 2001 to 20, when they were radicalized, when they actually became a terrorist force, which you couldn't say that they were in the 96-2001 period as yet. Then I would say that, its inauguration is a very bad augury. What we see is what we saw on August 26, 27 in the Kabul airport blasts, 200 Afghans being killed, US soldiers also being killed, the beginnings of ostensibly a kind of looming war between the Islamic State of Khorasan and the Taliban, and a number of other fault lines that we are seeing right now. Firstly, the fault line between the Taliban and the rest of the country, which I would still say is a majority which does not want the Taliban. The Taliban are an alien ideology, reared and nurtured elsewhere and imposed on Afghanistan, though they are part of the Afghan reality, and I would not deny that. But one is the clash between the Taliban and what we now know as a National Resistance Front or a National Resistance. And that resistance is taking various forms. It's taking the form of flag protests, which represent Afghan pluralism, women's protests, armed struggle in certain areas. Although Afghanistan is in a state of shock and the resistance is only just beginning. As the Taliban impose their repressive rule once again, and they haven't yet really shown signs of changing in that, I think we can only expect much greater opposition, if not resistance. Some of that resistance could take the form of an armed resistance as well. Secondly, we are seeing divisions and differences within the Taliban, particularly between the Kandahar group and the Haqqani network. What we have seen in the first days is a partial Haqqani takeover of the Taliban. And these differences are likely to magnify, not reduce. Along with those differences, we are likely to see, there has been difficulties in the Taliban Pakistani, and in particular Pakistani Army ISI relationship, and we are likely to see elements and factions of the Afghan Taliban disagreeing, differing, and perhaps even showing their disagreement with Pakistan and the ISI over a period of time. Then there is the factor of the Pashtuns, the Taliban, and also the resistance possibly taking on ethnic fault lines. They could take the form of Pashtun, non-Pashtun, but they could also take the form of North and South. We don't know in which direction this could develop. But in addition, we should not forget the fact that along with the Taliban, there have been at least a dozen or more regional extremist or radical outfits, including the Chechens, the IMU, groups targeting Tajikistan, sectarian groups targeting the Hazaras and the Shias, and some of the worst atrocities have been committed against them. You have, the Jundullah in Iran, and you have a range of Pakistani-based extremist outfits, many of them actually targeting India. So you have a whole bunch of them that are lined up there, for whom this is actually the beginning of their return on their investment over the last 20 years and the victory of the Taliban. So both internally and externally, we have an extremely disturbed picture. And it's not possible. And, a lot of people, when they talk about accepting reality, I think they tend to forget that this reality itself is very fluid. And what is today a reality may not be the reality tomorrow. In fact, what we seem to be seeing is a kind of Iraq, Syria, Libya type of situation looming before us. And therefore, the kind of policies that we have to follow would also have to factor all that. And I think the Delhi Declaration was a sign that, whatever may be happening on the diplomatic front, and we have a number of formats. We have the SCO format, we have the Troika format, the extended Troika format, where people might score points, diplomatic points against each other. That when it comes down to the real issues, which are the security issues, in fact, at least a large part of the region is pretty much on the same page. And the Delhi Declaration actually in many ways reflects precisely those concerns and those values. One is certainly the issue of sovereignty, which has been betrayed in this military takeover. Second is the issue of inclusivity, which all of you rightly pointed out. I think it's very much there in the statement, though how much it is realistic to expect the Taliban to actually become inclusive when it's very clear that actually a greater part of their agenda is against the Afghan people. The foreign troops have left, but the jihad continues, and the jihad continues against the Afghan people, against an ideology which is not shared by the rest of Afghanistan. The third, of course, is the concern about the spillover of radicalism and extremism and terrorism, now ostensibly from Afghanistan. Really a creation of Pakistan that has now been dumped effectively on Afghanistan. So I think this is a third concern that is very, very strong. A fourth concern that is reflected in the Delhi Declaration is this whole humanitarian aspect and crisis, and that needs to be addressed. Along with the humanitarian aspects, there is the whole concern about women's rights, about minorities, and about children and the treatment to them. And I think these are the sort of principal concerns that are reflected in the Delhi Declaration, which are pretty much the concerns of the international community. But look at the Delhi Declaration as a kind of almost intimate conversation between people who are most concerned about the impact of what has happened in what I would call really is the AFPAC area on the region as a whole. And this was the first meeting where they've got together to actually consult each other and try to devise some kind of consensus and strategy. And when I was talking about the outfits, the radical outfits, I forgot to mention the TTP. The TTP has already reared its head in Pakistan. Of course, Pakistan will try to milk this in its usual way as a victim and portray itself in the language of victimhood. But I think this is the reality that we face today. And overall, I think what I would say is that the international community really needs, instead of sort of dealing with Afghanistan in disparate and in bilateral and individualistic ways, really needs to get its act together, hopefully under the umbrella of the UN, so that the United Nations is actually empowered to use to actually deliver humanitarian aid and to actually make sure that it is delivered impartially to all the Afghan people who are the most, and particularly those who are the most needy, without any discrimination on any part. And I think that is where a collective action and a collective cooperation by the region and the world could be used to try to leverage the Taliban as much as possible to go against their DNA, to go against their mindset, which is of exclusivity, not of inclusivity, of a kind of radical version of Islam rather than an accepted Afghan version of Islam, and to compromise actually with other Afghans, not to really prioritize the emirate over Afghans, which is what they seem to have done so far. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, and I'm going to come back to you with a lot of questions, particularly your assertion really that the Taliban must learn to do things differently, but eventually, if they are seeing themselves as victors at the moment, how is it going to be possible to make them see that a different path is more is better for them? I want to come now to Ms. Hila Najib. And of course, in so many ways, you are seeing history repeat itself personally as well. The idea that it is difficult for you and thousands like you to go back to Afghanistan at present. And from what you hear of what is the situation inside Afghanistan, is there any strand of hope that people are feeling? What is it that you really think that the people who are not able to leave or have not left for whatever reason see as their future today in Afghanistan? Ms. Najib?
Yeah, thank you for having me and giving me this opportunity to share my opinions and views. What I would like to say is that the past 3 months have been intense for many Afghans for all the changes that have come. Afghans are resistant people, even in the hardest and harshest times. They might be in a difficult situation, but they don't give up so easily. Right now, before you introduced me, you said that, Taliban see themselves as winners or as the new, regime that has taken over Afghanistan. I don't see the Taliban as winners. And I wish that there was somebody from the Taliban, interim government present in our discussion to be able to say this directly. Because if the Taliban were the winners, people of Afghanistan wouldn't want to leave the country. If they were the winners, people of Afghanistan would be rejoicing their coming and taking over. If they were really winners, justice and elections and truth would prevail. And we have none of those at the moment. For me, what's really important as to what can be done, what could be the new relationship or new ways of looking at Afghanistan from India perspective, is to look back at the historical relationship of India in Afghanistan, because Afghan and Hindu relationship are even close, very close before India became an independent country. I remember reading the memoirs of Jawaharlal Nehru, where he writes to his daughter about how King Amanullah Khan is somewhere up in the hill stations where he's holding 2 months old Indira Gandhi in his arms, and they're talking about fighting the British Empire, or the fact of the matter that you had teachers from Shanti Niketan in Afghanistan, in 1920s, teaching the Afghan students. And if we look at the last 20 years, the kind of relationship India had with the Afghan people itself showed very clearly this close ties in the relationship of Indians in Afghanistan, especially the focus when it came to education. I remember studying in India 2006, 2007, where every semester you had about 350, 500 Afghan students coming in different universities in India. Or, for example, the possibility for Afghan people to come and start businesses or have healthcare assistance. These were all, beside the kind of financial aid and development aid that was given to the Afghan government, these projects were extremely important to highlight the Afghan and Indian people-to-people relationship, which I think, as a consequence of the 15th August, collapse of the Afghan government, this has sort of been kept on hold as well, because right now the situation in Afghanistan is dire because of the fact that the money is frozen. People are, facing a very harsh winter ahead of them. Girls are not allowed to go to school. Boys are not allowed to go to school, even by their own parents as a choice, because it's not safe. The fact of the matter that you've got, almost today, I read a report by Human Rights Watch that 20 million Afghans will be facing famine. This needs to be addressed because it's a global issue. The fact of the matter that you've got thousands of Afghans waiting for visas and waiting for borders to open, are not only issues that, as a global or a Western challenge, but a challenge for the region that needs to be considered. So for me, I think the two things that India, perhaps in the short term, could do is focus on extending this people-to-people relationship as to the fact that Afghans who need visas, even for them to be resettled in a third country, could be given. I remember when my family came to India, there were a lot of Afghans at that point of time in early 90s when the civil war started that came and stayed in India. They were given visas in India to eventually make their way out of India. And this is something that needs to be considered by, I think, Indian authorities seriously. The other thing is that if you've got majority of Afghan population, which are the youth, sitting at home, not being allowed to go to school, as the women and especially the boys, because there are certain security threats there, you are under this kind of extremist ideology, allowing young generations of Afghans to be radicalized. So it's really important that you do have channels of education and means of communication with the future generations of Afghanistan. India has always been a country where education was held in its high esteem, and I think that's something that we need to look at seriously in the long run for in terms of having this people-to-people relationship continue to be stronger. Politically, what's really interesting is that when we talk about inclusive government, how do you define inclusivity? Because one thing that has happened since the civil war in Afghanistan is that there was a shift of narrative, conflict narrative or fault lines from ideological, which was communist versus jihad or mujahideen, to an ethnic fault line. And what happens further with Bonn Agreement of 2001 is that this ethnic fault lines are, pushed further and sort of encouraged and politically and systemically and legally allowed to be practiced. But if you do go to the villages of Afghanistan, or I haven't been back, but I am in touch with people that actually see that this is not an issue. The ethnic rivalries are not a problem. It is the corrupt system in the past 20 years that used the same narratives of ethnic rivalries to be able to sustain itself in power. Now, if you want to have inclusive government, who are the one that will do this? And what kind of a system would they bring about to ensure this inclusivity is not for a certain group of people, but for the whole Afghan nation, from whatever ethnic backgrounds, whatever religious minorities? And this is the most important thing. What the United States and its allies couldn't do in the past 20 years is ensure that this system could be functional. And I think we saw this as well, that their peace process was exactly putting this narrative or shifting this narrative on the other side. And that's not how you bring about peace either. So for me, I think that's extremely important to make a note as to what do we mean by inclusivity. Thirdly, what's really important is that for me, it's still a question mark that in the newly built regional axis, where does India belong when it comes to Afghanistan? Because we did see, a shift of policies in the past decades between, India and the United States, which they got closer in terms of their foreign policy. But with the collapse of the current Afghan government and with the Taliban interim government being in place, where does India see itself in this new regional axis? Is something that would be interesting for me as an Afghan to understand. And last point I would like to make is the fact that we saw in the past 40 years, from the era of jihad during the Cold War up until now, that armed resistance have brought about groups in power for a short period of time. They don't have long-term impact. They do not have long-term effective outputs. So what exactly is the other alternative is something that India needs to look at. And that alternative is certainly not armed resistance. So what would that other alternative be? Something that needs to be looked at, I think, with the Afghans, including all players. Yeah, it's something that is an exciting opportunity, I must say, for the region, for India, but also a tough journey. And we shall see how the future should lead us. But I thank you once again for this opportunity, and I'm sure we will engage further in these discussions. You're mute. You're mute.
Sorry. All these months later, we are still making that same mute error on Zoom. And thank you. You know, you've put a lot of the issues in perspective for us, particularly the idea that when we talk about inclusivity, it cannot be just a checking of a box on ethnicity or gender. It has to be something that actually represents Afghanistan as a whole. But you ended on an interesting note where you spoke about the futility, in a sense, the long-term futility of armed interventions and armed resistances in Afghanistan. So that brings me to Ali Messam Nazri. I hope I'm saying your name correctly, the head of the Foreign Relations of the National Resistance Front. One of its most articulate spokespeople today, who's regularly reminding the world that this is not done. That the Taliban is not, it's not a fait accompli in Afghanistan, and that there are many reasons for the world to question everything that we are seeing in Afghanistan when it comes to this talk about a kind of stability for the moment in Afghanistan. And I think Ambassador Mukhopadhyay referred to that as well. May I ask you to give us your view of how successful do you think the National Resistance Front has even been in these 3 months of trying to project to the world that they mustn't just get used to a status quo in Afghanistan? How successful do you think your movement has been, and where do you see the possibilities of taking this forward, given the situation, given the Taliban's comfort levels in Afghanistan at present?
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be part of this discussion today, and with all the esteemed personalities of both India and Afghanistan. It's a wonderful opportunity that has been given to us to express our views on the way forward and possible solutions to the current mess that has unfolded in Afghanistan. Before answering your question, I would like to start a bit with the why we started the resistance. This is a question that I've been asked many times, and I believe Mrs. Najibullah also commented on the feasibility of a successful resistance that could solve the problems of Afghanistan. So for the past few years, we've been studying the crisis in our country, the conflict, the unending conflict that we've not only experienced in the past 40 years, but we see a pattern of conflict for the past few centuries in Afghanistan. And so we've always had a power vacuum throughout the throughout Afghanistan's history, and except for around 40 years of stability during Zahir Shah's reign, there has always been a conflict in Afghanistan and violence in one part of it, or if it wasn't throughout the country, at least there was violence and armed conflict in a few places. For the past few years, we tried sincerely to reach out to the Taliban to reach a political settlement that is acceptable to all of Afghanistan's communities, that could ensure the rights and freedom of all citizens, and that could finally solve Afghanistan's problems and the crises that has always caused instability in Afghanistan. the factors that have caused instability in Afghanistan. However, we did not see the sort of sincerity that we had from the other side, and their narrative was a narrative of dominance. They use religion and other means to justify their narrative of dominance. And after the fall of Kabul, for around 10 days, the National Resistance Front did reach out, and we had informal discussions with them, and we had negotiations. But we did not see a route that without violence, without resistance, peace in Afghanistan, stability in Afghanistan would be possible. Reconciliation in Afghanistan would be possible. They did not have they did not show goodwill when it came to negotiating on Afghanistan's future. When we did discuss forming a power structure, a political system that is acceptable to all, they did not show any interest. The only interest they had is terms of surrender, a way to incorporate other political forces in a system where they are dominant, and for others to only be tokens. And the National Resistance Front, we do not believe that inclusivity is for a few political figures to be in a government, to have a few ministries, directorates, or embassies, and to consider that as a government, as an inclusive government in a country like Afghanistan, which is made up of ethnic minorities. From day one, we made it clear that in a country made up of ethnic minorities, an inclusive government isn't one political force dominating politics and others being in the margins. And one of the reasons why we believe we've been having unending conflict throughout Afghanistan's history is because of this. You see a zero-sum game over power in Kabul, because power has always been concentrated in Kabul and in one position, which is, back in the days it was the monarchy. In the past 50 years, it has been the presidency. And everyone has been fighting over this. The competition has been over one city and over one position. And unless you find another alternative, you'll have this unending conflict continue in Afghanistan's future. And what we're seeing today is, okay, you have the National Resistance Front as the only front and political group outside of the Taliban that is challenging Kabul at the moment. And then you see another power struggle over Kabul within the Taliban. You have at least 5 factions fighting over power. And this, in reality, justifies our points when we raise our points that Afghanistan's problems, underlying problems, go back to a few centuries. It doesn't start with Bonn. It doesn't start with 1992. It doesn't start with 1978. It's just we've been seeing patterns throughout Afghanistan's history. And in order to solve these problems, the formula and the political solution that we've been proposing is, in order for us to solve this unending conflict, we have to address this problem that power cannot be concentrated in Kabul if we want peace, harmony, and stability in Afghanistan's future. If we want not only the internal conflict in Afghanistan to end, but even the external problems, the regional rivalries, the problems that we see between many countries in the region, it's all because power is concentrated in one city and in one person. So the political solution that we proposed, whether it was before August 15th, and what we stand for today, whether it's through negotiations in the future, there is no negotiations right now, but if there is ever an opportunity to solve this problem through talks and negotiations, if ever Taliban and their sponsors are sincere, or through armed struggle, through a resistance, is to establish a decentralized state where Kabul receives, where the center receives legitimacy from the peripheries, not the other way around, which has existed for the past few centuries. It's time to give the people a chance to be able to decide their future, to determine their future. And for us to empower the local level of governance and the provincial level of governance will allow everyone to see themselves in the power structure, will solve the whole zero-sum game that we're seeing throughout Afghanistan's future, and will allow the general population to prevent those individuals that many have mentioned that have monopolized power in Kabul and have allowed a corrupt class, political class, to monopolize power and to manipulate the general population. It will empower the people. It will allow the people to see themselves in the power structure. So this is the type of inclusive government that we're envisioning for Afghanistan's future. And we believe this is the only way to reach inclusivity. Inclusivity doesn't mean making someone prime minister or giving a few ministries or having a cabinet that has a percentage of every ethnic group. This is not inclusivity to us. So our vision for Afghanistan is clear. When it comes to India, we've always mentioned that one of the best examples for Afghanistan in the future is to learn from India's example, India's experiences throughout history. Afghanistan, like India, is a multicultural state. It's not a nation state. We have different identities in the country. We have different cultures. We have different religions, sects. And so nationalism doesn't work in our country. The only way forward in Afghanistan to solve many of these identity problems, many of these, to prevent the deepening of these social cleavages, whether it's sectarian, ethnic, and so forth, is to adopt multiculturalism, is to endorse and adopt cultural and political pluralism as the formula to move forward. So, and then the political system of India. So the federal system or the decentralized system that India has, we believe something similar like this, or something similar that exists in many other countries, could be good experiences and examples that Afghanistan could learn from and could implement. And we've never given this chance in Afghanistan. There's many critics. We have listened to these critics throughout the past 20 years, even before that decentralization will never work in Afghanistan. But we've tried centralization, we've tried a unitary system for the past 300 years, and it has constantly failed. Why should we keep experiencing something that has failed and not give something that hasn't been experienced in Afghanistan a chance? And so this is what the National Resistance Front is fighting for. We are not fighting, we are not resisting to continue a war in Afghanistan, to continue violence. If there is a viable path to peace in Afghanistan today, when we've experienced this many times, we're willing to lay down our arms. But when we see that one political force, which is a minority, tries to dominate power, this is unacceptable to the majority in Afghanistan. And today we see a terrorist group that has ties with other terrorist groups and is sponsored by a neighboring country take over most of the country, is terrorizing many communities, is forcefully removing people from their villages and provinces, is starting a process of genocide. How are we supposed to lay down our arms and believe that resistance cannot continue through these means? So I would like to thank all of you again, and I'm open to any questions. I would like to end with a comment. I forgot to answer your question, which is the resistance is continuing today. We have groups throughout the country for the past few months because people have realized that the Taliban cannot establish stability throughout the country this isn't a stabilizing force in the country. Actually, it is going to lead to more instability, to more problems, whether it's social, political, economic. They're looking for ways, and one alternative is to join the National Resistance Front, which is the only front right now that is looking for the interests of all of Afghanistan citizens, that is fighting for every citizen in the country, that is fighting for everyone's freedom, everyone's rights, and for the preservation of the republic and of the democracy. So this is the only option that the people have. There's many other options, which it is a much more destabilizing force for Afghanistan's future, but the only option right now that is appealing to the mass population is the National Resistance Front, because we are looking for ways to stabilize the situation. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. Mr. Nasri, in a sense, you've broadened the debate a little bit, because you're not saying that the answer to the situation we see today in Afghanistan is simply to have another government. It is to actually change the way Afghanistan has been. And of course, a lot of what you said about India, I'm not sure from inside India, we feel India is yet a very federal structure, or has yet rationalized its relationship with all its various multicultures. But we certainly would like to strive in that direction, as I know so many Afghans would. I want to come to Dr. Ashok Behuria next. He's not just an expert on the region, he's written books on South Asian cooperation. And Dr. Behuria, you've heard where everybody is. What is interesting about this discussion for me is that nobody has actually said that the situation is black and white, and all we have to do is, fight the current situation, and then there'll be something, whatever follows will be perfect. I think I also would like to see a little bit of perhaps discussion on what India's role actually can be, because it's not just about history or what has been India's role historically with Afghanistan. It's also simply geography. When you see the fact that India's ties with Pakistan are at a complete low, they, I think, at much, at possibly the lowest ebb they have been in the last few decades. When you see the fact that Pakistan does have, and Mr. Nasri referred to it, this kind of hold in Afghanistan today, and which means that relations with Pakistan could essentially cut us off from relations with Afghanistan, relations with Central Asia. We don't actually have an engagement with the Taliban. We don't really have a viable option via Iran, although India has built on the Chabahar option for years. That has depended very much on how much the United States is willing to make concessions for it. And we saw how difficult it was to develop Chabahar, even though the US gave India a waiver for Chabahar. And given the fact that the only other neighbor there is to Afghanistan is China, and India is in a military standoff with China at present, there doesn't seem to be the same. Even 3 years ago, they were talking about cooperation on Afghanistan. That doesn't seem to be a valid possibility right now. So if you just look at geography around Afghanistan and you look at India's limited options, I do want to ask you, where do you think India can go? Because Mr. Nasri spoke so much about India's internal situation, do you think there's even political appetite for making that difference that Ambassador Hydari so eloquently put about what India's role could be in Afghanistan? Do you think there's even a domestic political appetite with the Modi government, with the government to actually try and engage with all those changes?
Thank you, Suhasini. In fact, for last 1 hour or so, we have been talking about different issues, and there is both a disadvantage and an advantage in being the last speaker. So I would like to leverage my position in spite of it. In fact, from the pious hopes of Ambassador Hydari to the platitudes of Nizari, we have come full circle, in fact. In fact, through the realistic assessments made by Ambassador Mukherjee and Ms. Hilla, I think we have covered the whole gamut of issues. In fact, today the new slogan is inclusivity. Until yesterday, it was Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, Afghan-controlled process. So we need to sit up and ask today, is it now Afghan-led and Afghan-owned and Afghan-controlled? Now that Taliban have come to power, whether it is Taliban 2.0 or one of my friends in Pakistan terms it as Taliban 2.5, whatever it is, is Taliban really in power, and are they in a position to deliver if the international community really seeks to work with them? In fact, we have a lot of talks, headed in a direction which perhaps constrains the position of Taliban inside Afghanistan. In fact, if you talk about inclusivity too much, it starts from a premise, starts from a position that Taliban are not in a position to bring in an inclusive government. So far, the record has been very, very poor. And they have said that one Tajik, one Uzbek. They're basically thinking in terms of an interethnic, parity or interethnic participation in the process, rather than thinking in terms of gender or any other thing that comes your way. So in that sense, Taliban have a lot of ground to cover. It is on Taliban now to prove that they can be inclusive. They can really run the government in a more sophisticated manner. But all said and done, we must all acknowledge that the Taliban have, after they have come in, at least things have started precipitating in a manner that you do not get to see that kind of violence that you used to see before 15th of August. So in fact, in a certain way, the Afghan people have come to terms with Taliban, barring few sections, I would say. I'm not being a devil's advocate here. I'm just going by the information that is at hand in the open domain. I do not know whether Taliban are suppressing a lot of information, because sort of some videos are getting viral in the social media that they're doing this and doing that. They're getting into households. They're trying to sign bonds and sign different notes. So that's that apart. It has been all the reason to ponder over whether Afghanistan has been less violent under Taliban. So if that is so, now the question is whether countries like India, countries like Russia, China, Iran, Pakistan can really come together, and we're talking about the regional dynamic taking shape and helping out Afghanistan. In fact, we are talking about helping out the Taliban, or trying to pressurize Taliban to behave in a particular way. So in that sense, where are we really headed? In fact, Ambassador Haidari has a lot of pious hopes about Indian intervention. I think if wishes were hearses, I do not want to complete the sentence. There are a lot of wishes out there, but I think we must acknowledge that the internal political dynamic in Afghanistan has been a victim of various dynamics that are in the neighborhood. Like you have an India-Pakistan, China dynamics, you have a Russia-US dynamics, you have a US-China dynamics, and you have an Iran-Pakistan, China dynamics as well. So there are several dynamics operating at several levels around Afghanistan, which is keeping the reality in Afghanistan hostage to all this. Can there be a meeting of minds among all these regional players? Can we ever think of India and Pakistan working together in Afghanistan? We talked about Chabaha, and Suhasini has already very eloquently, underlined, the non-feasibility of that kind of an option. Well, we can spite the Pakistanis and say that, through that we can access. But where do you go to? You go to a country which is ridden in civil war, ridden with civil war. You cannot get into a country which is in such a mess and expect to access, there and, deliver out there. You cannot deliver at the moment unless and until you see that, Pakistanis and the Taliban jointly or separately want India to work there. This is the reality. Let us not close our eyes to reality and say that, everything is hunky-dory. It's not hunky-dory. Think the days are over. I have met, several, people, with sympathizers of Taliban and sympathizers of ISIS. You don't have to go elsewhere. You go to Escorts Hospital in Delhi, you go to, Apollo, you go to Max or Fortis, you'll find a lot of people out there who have availed of the medical tourism that we have put in place. And you talk to them and you find out that, all of them were at times, I keep talking to these people, on and off. And I found out that, they in fact thought that, there was no alternative to Taliban at one point of time. In spite of our thinking that, they were, horrible people, because as it was noticed, in the conversations today, all of you pointed out to the fact of corruption. Cigar report is hinting at that. 20 years of intervention by all these countries amounted to this. It's absolute failure in terms of state building. It's an absolute failure in terms of diplomatic engagement of Afghanistan. We have been too complacent about our interventions in Afghanistan. We thought that, we have got rid of Taliban and everything will be fine now. It has not been fine. Whether we say that it's a terrorist organization sponsored by Pakistan or whatever, I would say that given the kind of system that was put in place right in front of our eyes, without our intervening too much in the affairs and trying to turn off Afghanistan, help Afghanistan turn over a new leaf. Taliban were there around the corner. They were always waiting to come in. In fact, they put in, I think, a much more consolidated front vis-a-vis the government that we put in place. In fact, when I talked to my American friends over the last 20 years, I found that they were very, very complacent. And they were at war with the government in Afghanistan all the time. They had a different notion of corruption. They had a different notion of, how a government should function. And the guys that were there, Ghani, Karzai, whatever, Abdullah, and whatever, they had a different take. In some of my conversations, I have told my American friends that, you see, in the Oriental system, corruption is part of the game. So you should allow corruption, but you should try to allow the government to work. I would imagine that to a large extent, the government that dysfunctioned in Kabul was because of lack of cooperation from the US. They're putting in money, but they were bringing in a lot of their own people. In fact, some conservative estimates say about 70% of the money that they put in were siphoned back to US through their own contractors, through their own, advisors. So these are some of the issues that were not handled properly. Post facto, we are working on it. I get to hear a lot of good things about India, nonetheless. Many Afghan Pashtun friends of mine would tell me that Indian interventions, even through Kabul, have been very, very effective. Had been very, very effective. We are keeping our ambitions low, but whatever little we are doing on the developmental front in the rural hinterland, we are recognized well by even the Taliban. Even Taliban grudgingly has acknowledged this, that if India comes in and does this developmental work without getting into the politics of it, we'll be fine. Let us not dwell on the other dynamics that is emerging, because John Maynard Keynes once said that ideas are the most dangerous weapon invented by the humankind. Taliban have accessed a very dangerous idea and dangerous weapon, and how that idea can be taken up. We are also trying to get into that realm now, because without that, all this talk of Nijari Sahab, armed resistance, trying to fight out will not matter. In fact, they have floated that idea amongst the Afghan people, and it seems it's sinking in. And whether you accept it as legitimate or not, within the Afghan theater, it has achieved local legitimacy, whether you believe it or not. There are inter-ethnic issues. There are other issues as well. A civilized, a more educated group, elite which has come into being, they will not accept it. They will say that, well, they have not sold it successfully to the people of Afghanistan. But I believe that, there is something in it which has caught the imagination of the Afghan people. And forgive me for my being too, what do you say, optimistic about the Taliban. But I feel that, collectively we have to fight that idea as well. And how we fight that idea will depend on what kind of resources we put in and what kind of coalition that we build. Whether the Americans will be on board, whether the Brits will be in the mode. The Brits keep telling me that they know Afghanistan much more than anybody else, but they have destroyed Afghanistan in their own way. But but let that be a collective wisdom coming in, which will try to fight the idea that we call Taliban. Taliban is not a force; it's an idea. We have to remember that. So I will not dwell any further. I think the ideological, the ethnic, the cultural, and the additional contradictions that are emerging in Afghanistan will not subside until and unless we ensure that whether it is Troika Plus or Troika Minus or all the regional countries coming together, if there is no consensus on Afghanistan, Afghanistan will continue to suffer, whether with Taliban or without Taliban, whether with inclusive government or without. That is I may sound a little pessimistic, but that is how I look at it. Thank you.
Well, you're certainly making the point that there is no silver bullet. And it's interesting, that has emerged as one of the themes through our conversation today. We don't have a lot of time, but I want one question answered, if I may, and I'm going to go across to all our panelists today, maybe in reverse order. And the question is simply this: India has so far publicly, there have been many back-channel conversations away from the glare. The government of India that had said it would only recognize the Ghani government. It was a part, of the democratic process in Afghanistan. It has met the Indian ambassador in Doha, met with the Taliban representative, Mr. Stanikzai, once. The Indian official team that went to the Moscow format has met with the deputy prime minister of the Taliban once. So those are the two official conversations they've had. My question really is, given all that you have said, and it ranges, in terms of what India should do, how India can get involved, what is the future of Afghanistan. Given everything that you believe, do you think India should engage the Taliban in a more decided way? And by that I mean invite members of the Taliban government to India, send delegations there, open an embassy possibly. Should India be engaging the Taliban, given all that we know today? Dr. Behuria, I'll come to you first, and then I'm going to go in reverse order.
I think what you are saying that, on the face of it, it appears that, it is doable and we should do it. But if you go, if you know the reality on the ground is unfortunately against this kind of engagement that we plan to have with Taliban. We have come and people have said that we must engage Taliban. So I'm not the only one who is saying it. But the problem is, we have to operate through the international community. And at the moment, Americans, the Brits, and the others, they have all said that, first we have to allow Taliban to behave. I think that's a good way of going about it, but nothing prevents us. We are a nation of 130 crore people. So nothing stops us from reaching out to Taliban outside the government. That is something that I would rather be comfortable with. Like there are n number of ways in which this can be done, and we can also get into, because we must understand. There is a point raised about the TTP, and in fact, TTP is coming in a big way in the Pakistani scheme of things as far as India's intervention in Afghanistan is concerned. Pakistanis are convinced that Indians are supporting TTP through the erstwhile Afghan intelligence, even today, minus the government, and which is creating a lot of existential problem for Pakistan. And in fact, they are now talking to TTP through Taliban. I understand. My book on TTP has come out just now. It is in the way can download.
And it is very interesting that regardless of what Pakistan has said, the TTP has done at India's behest today.
Officially, no, that's
they
what I'm
have
saying.
a-
That's what I'm
yeah, they
saying.
have
Officially, it will be difficult. But unofficially, outside the government, talking to Taliban remains an option. Remains
All
an
right. Ali Nazri, what do you feel? After all, you've said that you were willing, the National Resistance Front was discussing a political settlement with the Taliban. Given the situation today, do you think India should actually engage the Taliban further, normalize it, as they say, or legitimize it? Or should India hold what it has said so far, that they will not engage with a government that has not got the legitimacy that the previous government had? Where do you stand on that?
So, first of all, I would like to point out that Afghanistan isn't an independent country at the moment.
Right.
Afghanistan has lost its independence. It's a protectorate of another country at the moment. It's dependent on another, has lost its foreign relations. The group that is controlling most of Afghanistan today, the Taliban, they do not have an independent foreign policy. They cannot decide on foreign policy. It's a bit akin to what we experienced in Afghanistan in the late 19th century, up to 1919, when the British Raj was deciding foreign policy for the rulers of Kabul. And we're seeing a repeat of that today. Since August 15th, 2021, most of the country has been taken over by a group that cannot be considered a government, hasn't been recognized even by their closest supporter, and they cannot manage foreign policy all by themselves. They're not one side of the argument is that they're incompetent. They're just a few illiterate, uneducated mullahs trying to run the affairs of a country. On the other side, they're a proxy of another country. And we see Afghanistan as an occupied country today, except for the areas that we control. The rest of the country is occupied by another country. Afghanistan has lost its freedom, has lost its independence, and the territorial integrity of Afghanistan has been lost, because we saw that firsthand during the operation against Panjshir in late August, early September. There were elements, non-Afghanistan elements on the front fighting us, trying to take over Panjshir. Fortunately, they were unable to take all of Panjshir, only the main road, but there were elements of other countries inside Afghanistan trying to subdue the National Resistance Front. So the problem with this question is we don't believe the Taliban can manage foreign policy because it's controlled in another country, in another capital, and whatever they dictate, the Taliban will follow their policies.
All right, but can I also ask you, Ali Nazri, are you disappointed that India has not done more to support the National Resistance Front, as it once worked with your, Commander Masood, worked with other leaders of what became the Northern Alliance? Are you disappointed that India has not been more supportive?
Well, I've expressed this numerous times, that the National Resistance Front is thankful to the international community, especially our allies, for preventing the recognition of a terrorist group as Afghanistan's government, as Afghanistan's representatives. One. Two, I believe just how we're in shock at the moment, even though we're almost in the third month, and the shock isn't over. The region is also in shock. So we cannot judge things at the moment. I believe we need time to pass and then judge who did what and why.
So the fact that there's no recognition yet is a cause for you, for some hope for you. Hila Najibullah, what do you think India should do when it comes to engaging the Taliban? Because after all, when you speak about the humanitarian crisis there, you speak about the fact that girls can't go to school, or that money is frozen, or that there's a famine over there. The truth is, there is nothing India or other parts of the international community are learning they can do without actually engaging with the Taliban, without having a better relationship, which will allow them to trust them. As it is, India is hampered by the fact that Pakistan will not allow goods to go across. So no food or medicine is allowed by the road route through Pakistan. But actually not having a relationship with the rulers, if you like, in Kabul at present, also hampers India in other ways, whether it comes to diplomatic assistance, whether it comes to possibly visas or helping minorities who are in Afghanistan. So where do you stand on this debate?
So first of all, when it comes to giving the Taliban legitimacy, they don't care whether you give them legitimacy or not, whether it's India or the US or whoever. So this is something that you need to keep in mind, because the 4 countries that give them legitimacy during the first 5 years, today are not giving them legitimacy, but some of them have embassies within Afghanistan, right? That means that some form of relationship is on. So this is something that I think it's important to keep in mind. Now, I might not agree with you that the international community, the UN, India can do much when it comes to humanitarian assistance, or, for example, education, or having people-to-people relationship. This is extremely important as a strategic objective, I think, for those countries that want to be involved, actively in Afghanistan, to find ways. And there are ways. For example, UNICEF is found technologically a way to be able to distribute money to people of Afghanistan without going through the Taliban. There are Afghans in the community now. There's again a danger that if it doesn't go through the Taliban, they can rule with the power of the gun. So how do you deal with it internationally? This is something that needs to be discussed, but there are ways, and those ways must be explored. What I liked about Mr. Bihuria's talk, that he brought up this reality that we cannot close our eyes, is the fact that what is, or how could this regional consensus come about in Afghanistan or around Afghan issues? When the national reconciliation policy of Dr. Najibullah was announced, there was a mechanism set, right? Now, I'm not saying that the circumstances are the same, because they've taken over. So reconciliation with who? But in terms of regional consensus, the mechanism talked about how the region, and then internationally, the main superpowers, then the Soviet Union and the United States, need to come together to agree as to what could be the political fate, and if neutrality could be assigned. Now, given the circumstances right now, it's very difficult, but this is an issue that needs to be explored, that needs to be talked about. What and how could the countries involved do in terms of finding a way that Afghanistan can be self-sustainable, and yet a country that could live in peace and with its neighbors without any kind of armed insurgency or continued conflict and violence. So this is extremely important, and I really like that idea that you were mentioning, Mr. Baruria, but something that nobody is touching upon, because yeah, it's an explored area. And finally, what I would like to say about the issue of resistance, I'm opposed to armed resistance. Perhaps it's the Gandhian philosophy that I've been influenced, but and I do follow the Pacha Khan philosophy of non-violence. And what's also really important here in terms of resistance is the fact that you have Daesh that nobody's talking about right now. Even the journalists in the media are interchangeably using terminologies like ISIS, ISKP, and ISIL. And there is not a single source that can come out and tell you, what they are and who they are and exactly how will the region deal with this. Thank you so much.
That's certainly interesting, and of course we can discuss that later. But the UNICEF project, of course, that Ms. Najibullah was referring to, is one in which UNICEF will register primary school teachers on their own and then fund them. So those are direct ways of dealing with the Afghan people without going through the Taliban. Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, I come to you. The truth is, I mean, obviously, I followed your writings, and you have consistently said that there isn't a need to engage the Taliban for India. But the fact is that it is happening. As Ms. Najibullah pointed out, 5 countries have embassies in Kabul. They are engaging. Countries like Turkmenistan have sent delegations there. Countries like Uzbekistan have received delegations from the Taliban. Russia also received a delegation. Today, as we speak, it is the P3. I mean, 3 members of the permanent members of the Security Council that are meeting with the Taliban foreign minister as we speak. So the question really, can India go without engaging with the Taliban? And if so, where do you think India should go?
Suhasini, a slight correction. Actually, I've never said that India should not engage with the Taliban. What I have always consistently said is that we should not legitimize, let alone recognize the Taliban, as there were some advocates for. And I would say that, there were lots of interesting points made, but I'll say that Afghanistan has suffered a triple betrayal. A betrayal of its sovereignty and independence to a third country and to a force created by a third country. A betrayal of what we all advocate, a kind of moderate democratic Islam for an extremist theocratic Islam, effectively. And thirdly, a betrayal of all the values of freedom and rights that in fact underpin modern civilization, starting with the French Revolution, through the American War of Independence, 2 world wars, and the colonial struggle. So the Afghan struggle is really much bigger than just a question of the Taliban, number one. So taking that into consideration, I still maintain that it may be necessary, because there are 2 or 3 other objectives that we are concerned about. One is that we are concerned about the humanitarian situation. 2, we are concerned that in our antipathy on the values of the Taliban, that we do not neglect and throw the baby with the bathwater, which is the Afghan people. So a people-to-people relationship. And that people-to-people relationship could even extend to trade. So that should be preserved. So in order to do that, in order to keep that people-to-people relationship, in order to be able to help Afghanistan in a humanitarian sense, even if Pakistan is trying to sever Afghanistan's historical relations with India, then trade is, of course, a very good mechanism to actually continue that relationship. So I would say that at some level, we may have to have a kind of pragmatic engagement, but definitely short of legit. And the third consideration is genuine inclusivity. I think this point has been made by both Mr. Nazari and Hila, that genuine inclusiveness, in other words, internal legitimacy within Afghanistan, which can only come about through a more inclusive, reconciliation process in which power is genuinely shared, not just tokenly shared. So I think that, and legitimization by India is a big thing. India is a very, very important country for Afghanistan. And if India, concedes that legitimacy, effectively we have sold the Afghan people. And I maintain that I don't really believe that the Taliban are representative of the Afghan people. And we should retain our faith and our commitment to the Afghan people who have lost their freedom, who've lost democracy, and who've lost their sovereignty at this moment. Sorry, you can't be heard, Suhasini.
And to you, Ambassador Haidari, obviously there are many grades to this, but whether it's engagement or legitimization, recognition, of course, is a very far way off. But as a diplomat, do you really think that the New Delhi, the government should now engage the Taliban diplomatically, or is this something that India must just wait and watch for the moment?
India, just like Ambassador Mukhopadhyay said, should engage, and I think it depends on engage on what and for what. And of course, the issues of common concern and interest that we all discussed are also, I think, issues on which India may engage with the Taliban. But remember, I think the externalities of insecurity, weak governance, state collapse, which we have discussed, actually require incentive compatibility. That's what political scientists call, as unfortunately fast diminished, and that's why the United States simply abandoned Afghanistan and committed this colossal betrayal of democracy and human rights and women's rights, simply because President Biden said that our priorities have shifted. And shifted to China, pivoting to China. As much as, of course, now there are Republicans who argue that the United States should have maintained military presence in Afghanistan, even for that reason. But at least under the U.S. Biden administration, that incentive compatibility is no longer there. As a result, no interest in addressing the challenges of interference from Pakistan and Afghanistan through radicalization and deployment of those radicalized to terrorize Afghanistan and to bring about the situation that we see on the one hand, as well as regional and global terrorism. You have Al Qaeda and Daesh and ATIM, IMU, and the rest in Afghanistan, and of course the global transnational challenge of narcotics and organized crime, very much centered in Afghanistan. We haven't touched on that, but remember that Afghanistan provides still now 100% of drugs in the world, which on the black market costs over between 50 to 350 billion dollars. If you think about how we can fight and address that challenge with no resources, it itself is a problem. And corruption was also discussed, as much as we have all criticized Islamic Republic, leaders that have come and gone and fled. But that corruption is also an externality, very much tied to the ways in which the international community, has operated in Afghanistan. That's why I remain extremely, concerned about the way the United Nations will spend the pledged resources of the, $1.2 billion that was pledged in Geneva, for example. Only 1/3 will actually, reach the beneficiaries. The rest will, go towards overhead costs, salaries, and so on and so forth. So that, very crafting ways in which the international community has involved in Afghanistan. Then that brings me to the issue of the UN mandate, which we just left out. UNAMA has been one of the weakest mandates in the history of the, United Nations intervention. And if you see, it's just now been reduced to meetings by the special rep or deputy with the Taliban and shuttle diplomacy here and there, but nothing else. So while Afghanistan is very much a peace enforcement mission, and that peace enforcement again means UN peacekeepers with a strong mandate, as well as implementation force such as that we saw in the Balkans and Bosnia. That's not again there simply because there is of a lack of incentive compatibility that NATO just withdrew its forces, no longer interested in maintaining an implementation force for peace enforcement. Say if the Doha Agreement has finally been reached and signed by all sides, and an inclusive government is formed, then the implementation of that agreement also needs enforcement. As a result, the coercive force that needs to be there. So if India wants to do anything meaningful, I think it needs to work towards those diminishing the severity of those externalities that unfortunately impact the Afghan people today and on the medium term to a long term. Definitely work for a stronger UN mandate with a coercive strategy. There's deployment of UN peacekeepers with stronger mandate to actually enforce peace. And on the specifics I just pointed out, I think those are not too idealistic, and I'm not very satisfied with India's performance. India's done the least in terms of providing, relief assistance, even, taking refugees. I think there are more refugees going to Iran and Pakistan, despite the complaints that we have had, than to India. How many planes India could send during those difficult days to pick up all those, civil society advocates and activists, and most of them even educated in India, to provide them with shelter and at least space to work for some time, and then maybe down the road citizenship. I've been recently working with Indians, with Canadians, with Iranians and Canadians. What I hardly expected from Iranians is actually happening, and they're doing, I think, a great job when it comes to, streamlining the way Afghans can get out of Kabul to Mashhad, and from Mashhad to the, onward destinations. Even India could work out with the Taliban when it comes to engagement to allow, such flights from Kabul to India and then onward destinations. So there's a lot that India could have and should do and must do tangibly to help Afghanistan. But all we see, to be honest, is more talk and talking about the $3 billion that, of course, we appreciate, we're grateful for, but as the largest democracy, so much expectations that Afghans have, including myself. That's why I set the stage, and we heard from Ms. Najibullah and others who have lived in India. I think whether the current administration, whether, whatever the issues and the challenges that better, I think has not really lived up as a good neighbor, as a neighbor that is most favored and most loved, and really on a people-to-people level. And as someone that I spent time in Delhi, I'd expected a lot more from India, just tangibly speaking, just on humanitarian issues, let alone all those big issues that I talked about, externality, UN mandate, and so on and so forth. Even I think I was not very satisfied with India's performance in the UN Security Council as you were holding the presidency, still maybe holding the presidency, to have done a lot more to speak, during the days when the Taliban were actually reaching the gates of Kabul. So thank you.
I think that's very well put. And I think you speak for many Indians too, who are quite amazed that the government has not actually opened its doors to more people from Afghanistan, facilitated their movement here. In fact, the government actually canceled all pre-existing visas given to Afghans as well. And it remains to be seen, just how much they will be able to open. So I think that's a good note to end that at. There are very concrete suggestions in there, in what you've said, Ambassador Haidari, as well as everyone else, on where India could see its engagement go. What's interesting about this discussion has been that it hasn't just been what everyone expected to hear. There are many nuances. There are many places where India can play a role without necessarily getting into what I'd started at the beginning, speaking about this black and white debate over Afghanistan that we hear otherwise. There are many unfulfilled promises from inside Afghanistan, but we must remember also many from the rest of the international community. And we can only hope that this is not, this is just a work in progress, that we will come back to this discussion again after a few months, and we will be able to see newer paths being lit up for the people of Afghanistan. So on that note, I'd like to thank everyone on this panel for joining us today. I do want to apologize for the noise behind me. It just seems to be some construction. I also wanted to make the point that the organizers, the Afghanistan Institute of Strategic Studies, did try to bring on someone who was a Taliban spokesperson onto this panel as well. And I'm sure they'll keep trying, because inclusivity means many things, but it certainly does mean hearing everyone out. So from everyone here, thanks so much for joining us today, and from all the viewers, thank you for listening in.